I'm Barry Maxwell, and I'll be talking to you about the advent of Muhammad, the religion of Islam, and how all of this came out of the peninsula of Saudi Arabia. This will include part of what I will call the Arab people's historic narrative. Historical narratives are stories that peoples tell themselves about who they are, where they came from, and in almost all cases it's a combination of fact and myth. Sort of like George Washington and the cherry tree in an American sense, but it's what people believe, and it helps define who they are and their view of history. And it's important to know if you're going to understand their current day motivations and what bothers them and what doesn't. So, starting with the Arabian Peninsula, I've overlaid on the map of part of the United States the outline of the country Saudi Arabia, giving you an idea of scale. Also letting you see a bit that's not there, Yemen and Oman to the south. But given the geography, they weren't a central part of what happened on the main part of the peninsula anyway. You'll notice a couple things, one of which is the spot that I picked includes the Mississippi Valley of the United States, lots of rivers, the Great Lakes to the north, lots of water. Not so on the Arabian Peninsula, which harsh terrain, mostly desert, some mountains. Again, notice there's no big lakes, no rivers, not a lot of water in existence. You do get some amount of rainfall, much of which soaks into the ground, so you have to dig for wells. Occasionally you have it collect in little tiny lakes or ponds that might form an oasis, but a lot less than what we are used to in America or in Europe for that matter. Because of that, food's pretty scarce. Without a lot of water, you can't grow a lot of crops or animals, and not a lot of forage out there for the animals to feed on. And so concentrating large numbers of people in this part of the world was not possible. So you don't get empires like you get over in Egypt with the Nile River, or the Babylonian empires up in the Tigris and Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. So about the largest social organization you get are tribes, which formed out of families that grouped together to try and survive and cooperate with each other. The other thing you don't get without large-scale groups of people is you don't get government, you don't get policemen, prosecutors, courts, all those extras that subsist off of other people's production in society. And so you don't have traditional law enforcement mechanism or even traditional laws for that matter. Not a lot was written down. Most things were orally passed on. In a nomadic society, you just couldn't lug around a lot of old stuff, but people could remember quite a bit and did. So what you did get, it formed over thousands of years of the people that did live in this harsh peninsula, is something called Muruwa, the Arab code of behavior that existed pretty much until Muhammad showed up, and much of which carries through today even still, some of it in the religion of Islam, some of it just in Arab culture. Loyalty to the group, the tribe, the family, a big deal, without which people couldn't survive. If you were by yourself, you were in big trouble. And so they had to stick together, and that became a very socially important thing. A lot of social pressure to pull your weight, to help out the group, help out the weaker members. Not very tolerant of lazy people, but recognized that some had more abilities than others, and everybody was going to try and work for the greater good as well as their own. Now, part of that is dealing with violence. In this kind of situation, it might have devolved to everybody killing everybody else to get whatever they wanted, be it water, food, or other resources. And there was some of that went on, so it wasn't like it was a completely peaceful place. But to keep it from being all the time violent, they developed some customs to try and deal with that, one of which was the idea of long-standing revenge. Sounds a little silly, but it actually worked relatively well at the time, because if you knew that going over and killing somebody to take their stuff or stealing from somebody might get you into a blood feud that could last generations, with people coming after you, your kids, and your grandkids, people thought twice about whether or not they were going to get into something that might cause that. So it was, again, a way to moderate the violence somewhat. Survival dictated that the warrior ethic was a big deal, bravery a big deal, warrior skills a big deal, and so these were highly prized in the culture as well. However, also to survive, they needed to be able to do some trading and traveling. Again, something you can't do if you always had to be worried about being killed. So the idea of like, hey, don't mess with me or my clan will come after you was a useful protective measure. The idea of extending hospitality to the visitor, to invite actual people to come visit for purposes of trade and just finding out the news and other things that could be shared, was important, and that's been built into Arab culture for a really long time. And the idea of making religious shrines off limits to warfare, so people could gather, do their religious business, and pray. And then they got the idea of doing trading at those same spots as well, so a place to not fight and exchange goods. And Mecca, which had a local religious shrine, several of them as a matter of fact, because the Arabs were, after all, at that point in time, what we today would call pagans, with lots of different gods, often different ones for different tribes, and so on. So shortly before Muhammad is born, trade patterns change. You've probably all heard of the idea of spices and silks and whatnot going from the Far East, China, and so on to Europe. And much of it passed through areas near here, usually to the north, where life was a little easier. But fights between the Sassanid Persians in what is today Iran and the Byzantine Christians in what is today Turkey made the northern routes a little too risky, and so trade routes moved to the south and through the Arabian Peninsula. One place that profited by this was Mecca. Was a place where roads and trails and caravans could pass through, and becoming a trade hub was great for the locals, many of them anyway, some of which got very rich off of organizing this trade and participating in it. Some prospered more than others, which brought about a situation that Muhammad grew up in, where though he grows up to be a very smart individual, capable trader, good politician, worked well with people, wasn't as rich as many, and not as well connected through family. He'd been orphaned early on, and though his uncle eventually kind of takes him in to give him some family protection, he again didn't have the in that many others did, and so often saw himself as a bit of an outsider, and felt connected to some of the less fortunate, poor, orphaned, and widows that weren't so well taken care of in this new, richer society. That was having trouble reconciling its newfound wealth that some had and some didn't with the older Arab culture of the Bedouin taking care of each other. So, as sometimes happens, the really rich exploit the really poor because they have the ability to do that. Exploiting widows, supposed to take care of them, manage their funds, but some got stolen. And loaning money out to the poor people at really high interest rates and even more ferocious consequences if you didn't pay it back on time, similar to today's loan sharks. And again, a lot of social turmoil because of this. You think of today's 1% versus the 99% Occupy Wall Street movement, and you get a little bit of an idea of some of the turmoil that was going on. So out of all this, Muhammad is reflecting on what's going on, the problems that he's seeing, has a spiritual bent to it, goes off to meditate, visits a cave in the hills above Mecca, where he's reports being visited by the angel Gabriel. It happens a number of times over the years, and he's given these visions and revelations, as it were, about what God wants, and he comes to believe that there is only one God. It's the same God as the Jews, same God as the Christians. Just the Arabic word for God with a capital G is Allah. It's not some different entity, but the same one that the two earlier religions worshipped. And these revelations, as he has them over the years, become the basis for the Quran, sort of the Muslim version of the Christian Bible or the Jewish Torah. And he didn't see himself as founding a new religion, but correcting misinterpretations and getting off course that he thought had happened from the original Judeo-Christian religions. Christians had passed through. He'd met Jews in his caravan travels, and so had a idea anyway about what those religions were about, and again was trying to build upon that. So he does convince some others. Those that come to believe as he does call themselves Muslims, as in one who professes faith in the one true God and that Muhammad was his last messenger. And the group, Islam, are those who surrender to the will of God, and that becomes the name of the religion eventually. And they see themselves as a community, or the Ummah, of believers, sort of a new tribe, as Muhammad was hoping to have them become, so they wouldn't be divided along class lines, along cultural lines, social lines, just be all one group of believers, was his hope. Didn't quite pull it off. Some aren't convinced or are threatened by his message of social justice, especially the richer ones, so there is some conflict. He's eventually driven out of Mecca, comes back later with a larger group of folks and takes Mecca over. It doesn't kill everybody, as was the custom at the time, and works out a deal with them instead. And again, a different individual. We'll talk more about him later in terms of how violent he was, or how violent the religion is. So a bit more about the religion, sort of 5 main pillars that you can expect a practicing Muslim to do. 1, the profession of faith. Praying 5 times a day. Muhammad was a big believer on being connected in a daily, multiple times a day way with God. Very direct relationship without a priesthood to be in intervening. And what better way than to multiple times a day be thinking about God and your relationship with Him. Another one was the pilgrimage or trip to the city of Mecca, otherwise known as the Hajj. You can tell Muslims that have been there because that becomes a prefix to their name, sort of like doctor might be in the West. Fasting during the month of Ramadan, a lunar month, so it's a different time each year, but tends to be during the summer or fall months for the most part in our calendar. And the idea was to remember what it's like to not have things, to be poor. And so we'll do without, once a day, save the eating for nighttime. And boy, you better. And so nothing fun or wonderful during the day. No sex, no smoking, drinking, anything. And there's a pretty big party traditionally when the month is over with. And finally, again, back to the social justice thing. Giving to the poor. You were expected. A good Muslim is expected every year to give 2.5% of your wealth, whatever you owned, to the poor, done either on your own, or some governments later on take up the job of collecting that and theoretically would pass it out as welfare payments or gifts to the poor. A bit about the difference between Sunni and Shia. Many of you have heard of those. They're essentially just different branches of the religion. Any religion that's been around long, has disagreements and breaks into sects or parts. Islam is no different. There are a number of them. These are the 2 biggest, and it happens relatively early on. Over who's going to take over after Muhammad dies as the leader of the religious community. Some say that he said, "Choose among you from the community." Others thought they should go with the Arab tradition at the time, which would have been the senior male heir or relative, which in his case, since both of his male children died in infancy, there weren't any, so his son-in-law of his oldest daughter, who happened to also be a cousin, named Ali, was put forward by some, but was voted down. But there was some disgruntlement over this break with tradition, and eventually Ali does wind up as leader. He's number 4 in line, as it turns out. After the first 2 die, the third is assassinated, and then unfortunately Ali gets assassinated by some of his supporters that didn't think he behaved properly once he got into office, as he tried to navigate a very complex set of politics and various factions that he found himself facing by the time he was asked to run things. Once he's dead, the argument continues. Should his sons take over? One of them says, nope, I don't want to get killed. One of the younger ones, Hussein, grandson of Muhammad, does attempt to take control, but is beaten back by superior forces from others, and eventually is killed at the Battle of Karbala. A supposedly epic event, outnumbered greatly, and he's killed by, again, the story goes, 100 arrows is what it took to kill him, and he's remembered by Shia to this day. His death is celebrated. There's a shrine in modern-day Iraq for him, and the Shia ever since then, both because they continue to be persecuted as a minority of believing something different, have a sort of an element of reverence for persecution and a certain lack of tolerance for being persecuted and a certain militancy that they've developed. The other big difference is they're a lot more inclined to pay attention to what their religious scholars want them to do in terms of how to behave in a political sense, to the extent that you might even see religious scholars become leaders of the group, as in Iran, where the people running the country at the top are religious scholars that have elected themselves. Muhammad manages to unite most of the Arabian Peninsula under his control, politically and militarily. His successors spread out even further than that, all across the Middle East, and eventually later on into Europe through Spain, and over a relatively short period of time. They're aided in this by the fact that both the Byzantine and Sassanid empires are decaying and starting to fall apart. Not completely, but so they're not very good at resisting this. The Sassanid Empire is so hollow that when the Arab invaders come knocking, that empire just sort of falls apart. So the Arabs are able to conquer all the way into what is modern-day Pakistan and parts of India. A little more resistance from Byzantine Christians as they head out into Jerusalem and especially Egypt and on. But Muslims get a lot of local support because they're viewed as more tolerant religiously than the Byzantine Christians, less greedy. Taxes weren't as high, so they were actually invited in a lot of places and welcomed as liberators in some ways. The Muslims didn't require the conquered peoples to convert to Islam. And as long as you behaved and paid your taxes, you could be a serving citizen and get along fine. You might pay less taxes if you were Muslim, so some did convert, but not required. And the other thing was the Bedouin Arabs were somewhat better at mobile desert warfare than the Byzantines were, which helped out some also. So here's a map of what all they conquered. The blue is areas Muhammad took control of. His immediate successors, the sort of bluish green, and then the straight green took a little bit longer, but eventually got there. And this empire was not only far-reaching geographically, rivaling the earlier Roman Empire, but prized learning, commerce, trade. Arab soldiers and policemen, protect the trade routes. Allows phenomenal amounts of goods to move back and forth from one end of the empire to the other. Aided by the idea of credit and the check to pay for things, so you just have to move pieces of paper rather than everybody lugging a lot of gold around. So you could have banks that would be central clearinghouses for the paper to change hands without the gold itself having to move around. And centers of learning. You had universities, especially in Baghdad. Learned people from all over the world were invited to participate. Science was valued, knowledge was valued, and at the time not seen as a conflict with their Islamic faith. The thinking was that God created the universe and would make it work in certain ways, and we can discover how those work, and we ought to. And this predates the European Renaissance, so all this learning and philosophizing and discovery is going on while the Europeans are still in the Middle Ages. actually persecuting people that might question the supreme reign of faith. However, empires usually come to an end, and this one was no different. Some of it was internal decay, fragmentation, disputes between different families and dynasties. The Crusades helped a little bit, although didn't hurt them that badly. Much more important was the Mongol invasion a few years later. It comes out of the east, takes Baghdad, Damascus, gets almost all the way to Jerusalem. So they're well into the center of the Arab Empire before they get stopped. And this really knocks the Arabs off their situation as the social and religious rulers of the Islamic Empire. So Arab Empire and Islamic Empire are no longer synonymous. The Ottoman Turks, who are also Muslim, eventually take over, and they don't quite grab onto control of all of the old Arab Empire, but much of it, and retain control over most of it until the Europeans gain power over them latter part of the 1700s, up until which time the Ottomans had been feared even in Western Europe. And then, Napoleon invades, and the Western Europe, especially Britain, has a lot of say-so and a lot of influence, meddling, the way the Arabs would look at it, in Middle Eastern affairs well into the 20th century and even to some extent today. A criticism that's leveled at American involvement in the region. A bit more about the religion. Many of you have heard of Sharia, often known as Islamic religious law, and it's not quite that straightforward, but here's a bit about it. Sharia directly translates to the path to the watering hole, which, if you think about how scarce water was, the path to wisdom, the path to belief, the path to where the water is, pretty important stuff. Primarily the Quran is to Islam as the Bible is to Christianity. But similar to the way some today might ask, what would Jesus do? A very important part of religious beliefs in Islam is, what would Muhammad do? What did he do? What did he say? What were his opinions? And he had a lot of them, rendered judgments about a lot of things, many of which were recorded, some of which written down eventually, some of which passed on orally. So a large part of Islamic scholarship and Islamic legal opinions has to do with how reliable these reportings were and whether or not they should be followed. Reasoning by analogy, again, what would Jesus do question. Muhammad felt that alcohol got in the way of the relationship between people and God, and so prohibited it. And reasoning by analogy, he would probably say the same thing about cocaine or marijuana. Early on, you might get decisions about, out of the elders or just consensus of the Muslim community. It's with 1.5 billion people today, it's way too big to do that. But sometimes Islamic scholars and Islamic judges play a part, especially in the Shia branch. I've sometimes been asked whether Islam is inherently violent or not. Not really. For his time, Muhammad was a very modern and forward-thinking individual, which, by today's standards even, rivaled what Western thought and custom was up until maybe 100 years ago. In terms of his advocacy for rights for women, not equality, but much greater standing than they'd had before in terms of rights to inherit, rights to property, rights to children in divorce, and so on. Also, he was not revered Jews and Christians as fellow travelers, children of the book, wanted to include them in his religion, and did not seek to oppress them. And he was a good politician, always trying to include people, finding ways to make alliances, make deals if he could. And violence and killing people was kind of a last resort, although would do it if necessary. Unlike conventions of the day where the conquered were either killed or enslaved, in his system were offered a role in society, provided you behaved and paid your taxes. You didn't have to convert, though many did, because there was some higher social standing if you did, and sometimes a tax break, if you can believe that. in the Quran, there are some references to killing unbelievers, but when you read the context of what was going on when those things were said, it was always about not just that they were unbelievers, but it was about that they had done things. They had betrayed Muhammad, violated treaties, broken alliances, which you can imagine in the middle of a war, having somebody switch sides, was an ally, now they're an enemy, don't like having that happen. So there's some harsh words for such individuals, such groups in the Quran. One thing about the word jihad, you hear that a lot. It is not a let's go kill all the unbelievers. Literally translated, and you ask most Muslims today, it's a struggle between good and evil. Whatever that is, however that you define that. Which I recall one acquaintance of mine who's a Muslim talked about the jihad to get his finals done in college. The temptation to stray from the right work that you're supposed to be doing, i.e. get through school and graduate, versus go out and party and not do his homework. And that was a time when he used jihad, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, thanks for listening to the lecture.